The harsh Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly before Jake, its stark beauty only broken by the snow that covered everything in a soft, frozen blanket. The towering trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of ice and frost. The air was bitterly cold, biting at Jake's exposed skin despite the heavy layers of clothing he wore. His breath rose in steady puffs, visible in the freezing temperatures, as he trudged onward, his boots crunching against the snow-covered ground. The wilderness was both unforgiving and mesmerizing, a place that demanded respect from anyone daring enough to traverse it. Jake was no stranger to this kind of terrain. As a seasoned hunter, he had spent countless hours navigating remote landscapes, tracking wild animals with a practiced eye. He had encountered all manner of creatures over the years, from agile deer to cunning wolves, each encounter teaching him something new about the raw, untamed beauty of nature. But for all his experience, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to see. He had been tracking a grizzly bear for hours, following its trail through the snow with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. The footprints left behind by the massive animal were deep and unmistakable, each one telling a story of power and purpose. Jake's fingers tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder as he pressed on, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. His mission was clear: find the bear, study its movements, and, if necessary, take it down. The bear wasn't just any ordinary grizzly. It had become infamous in the surrounding villages, a ghostly presence that haunted the lives of those who called the wilderness home. It had attacked livestock, destroyed property, and caused a wave of fear to ripple through the small, tightly knit community. Jake understood the seriousness of his task. While he had a deep respect for the creatures of the wild, he also knew that some animals, when they posed a threat to human life, had to be controlled. The delicate balance between nature and humanity demanded it. But as he approached a cluster of trees, the snow crunching softly under his boots, something stopped him in his tracks. He froze, every sense heightened, his heart pounding in his chest. Beyond the trees in a small clearing was the grizzly bear. But it wasn't what he had been expecting. The bear was sitting on the snow, its massive frame hunched over in a way that seemed unnatural for such a powerful creature. Its fur, thick and dark, was dusted with snowflakes. But it wasn't the bear's physical presence that stunned Jake. It was its eyes. Dark and glistening, the bear's eyes were filled with an unimaginable sadness. And then Jake saw it, the unmistakable trail of tears running down the bear's face, catching the light as they fell and froze against its fur. Jake's heart dropped into his stomach. He stood motionless, his breath caught in his throat, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Bears didn't cry. At least they weren't supposed to. They didn't show weakness, didn't exhibit emotions in the way humans did. They were primal, driven by instinct and survival, creatures of the wild who existed on the raw edge of life. And yet here it was, a grizzly bear, one of nature's most formidable predators, reduced to a state of sorrow so profound that Jake could feel it in his own chest. For a moment, Jake questioned his senses. Was this real? Was the cold playing tricks on him, or was he seeing something that defied explanation? He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. But nothing changed. The bear remained there, hunched and crying, its massive paws cradled over its face as though it were trying to hide its pain from the world. The sight was so utterly human that it sent a chill down Jake's spine, one that had nothing to do with the icy air around him. He felt a wave of emotions crash over him: confusion, disbelief, and, most unexpectedly, an aching sadness. The bear, which he had thought of as a dangerous predator, now seemed so vulnerable, so broken. Jake couldn't reconcile the image in front of him with the stories he had heard from the villagers. Where was the fearsome creature that had terrorized their livestock and homes? This bear, with its heaving shoulders and tear-streaked face, was nothing like the menacing figure he had imagined. As Jake stood there rooted to the spot, he noticed something else. The bear wasn't just crying. Its cries were soft but deeply pained, a low whimpering sound that resonated in the stillness of the wilderness. It was a sound that spoke of suffering, of loss, of something that Jake couldn't yet understand. He felt his instincts as a hunter battling with something deeper, something more human. The desire to approach the bear, to understand its pain, was almost overwhelming, but his training warned him to be cautious. This was still a wild animal after all. Slowly, Jake forced himself to take a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the snow. The sound of his movement was loud in the silence, and the bear's head snapped up, its tear-filled eyes locking onto his. For a moment, Jake's breath hitched in his throat. The bear's gaze was intense, piercing, and filled with something that Jake had never seen in any wild animal: vulnerability. There was no aggression in its eyes, no sign of the ferocity he had been expecting. Instead, there was a plea, silent but unmistakable. "Hey there," Jake murmured softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. He wasn't even sure why he spoke. The words came unbidden, as though his own emotions had found their voice. He didn't expect the bear to react, but to his astonishment, it did. The bear tilted its massive head slightly, as though it were trying to understand him, and let out another soft, pained whimper. Jake's heart clenched. He took another cautious step forward, his body tense but his movements slow and deliberate. The bear didn't move, didn't show any signs of fear or hostility. Instead, it stayed where it was, its eyes never leaving Jake's. The connection between them was undeniable, a fragile thread that tied them together in that moment. As Jake drew closer, he began to see the details he had missed from a distance. The bear's fur was matted in places, and there were patches of dried blood on its left paw. The sight made Jake's stomach turn. The paw was mangled, twisted at an unnatural angle, and it didn't take long for Jake to realize what had happened. The scars around the wound were unmistakable. The bear had been caught in a trap. A poacher's snare, cruel and unrelenting, had done this. Jake felt a surge of anger rise within him. The thought of what the bear must have endured filled him with a sense of guilt. This wasn't just a creature of the wild. It was a victim, a living being that had suffered at the hands of human cruelty. The tears in its eyes, the sorrow in its cries. They all made sense now. Jake realized he wasn't looking at a dangerous predator. He was looking at a creature that had been broken by pain, just as capable of suffering as any human. For the first time in his life, Jake felt the weight of his role as a hunter shift. He wasn't just a tracker or a protector of the wilderness. He was standing before a creature that needed him, and he couldn't turn away. The bear let out a soft, pained whimper that echoed through the stillness of the Alaskan wilderness. The sound, both haunting and heartbreaking, stopped Jake in his tracks. His heart, which had been pounding from the exertion of tracking the grizzly, now beat with a new intensity, a mix of apprehension and something deeper, more human. Was the bear hurt? Was it sick? The questions raced through Jake's mind, each one laced with a growing sense of urgency. He took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert, to tread carefully, but his heart pulling him toward the creature in distress. There was something about the bear's whimper, something raw and sorrowful, that Jake couldn't ignore. "Hey there," Jake murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't even sure why he spoke. The words tumbled out as if they could somehow bridge the impossible gap between man and beast. He expected nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. But to his utter surprise, the grizzly turned its massive head, its dark, sorrowful eyes locking onto his. The look it gave him sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the look of a predator sizing up its prey, nor was it the wild, defensive glare of a cornered animal. It was something entirely different, something Jake had never seen in a wild creature before. Vulnerability. The bear's large, wet eyes glistened with fear, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. He stood frozen, caught between his training as a hunter and the raw emotion emanating from the wounded animal. The bear took a hesitant step toward him, its massive claws scraping against the snow with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the otherwise silent clearing. Jake's pulse quickened as the bear let out another soft whimper, the sound pulling at something deep within him. The bear's pain was palpable, radiating from its very being, and for a moment, Jake felt as though he could feel it himself. "Easy there," Jake muttered, his voice trembling slightly as he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. He knew better than to rush forward. This was still a grizzly bear, after all. It was powerful, unpredictable, and capable of turning on him in an instant if it felt threatened. But Jake's instincts as a hunter were warring with something much stronger, a deep, undeniable compassion that he couldn't push aside. He had encountered many animals in his lifetime, but never one like this. This bear wasn't looking to fight, wasn't trying to intimidate him. If anything, it seemed to be pleading with him. The grizzly let out another pained cry, the sound deeper and more guttural this time, as though it was trying to communicate something. Jake's chest tightened, the weight of the bear's suffering pressing down on him. He had never felt so helpless. The bear wasn't just an animal in the wild anymore. It was a living, breathing creature in need, and it was looking to him for help. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Bears didn't cry. They didn't show weakness or vulnerability. They were primal, driven by instinct and survival. And yet, here was this massive creature, one of the most formidable predators in the wilderness, reduced to a state of raw, aching sorrow. Jake took another cautious step forward, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. His movements were slow and deliberate, his body tense with both fear and determination. He was now only a few feet away from the bear, close enough to see the rise and fall of its chest as it breathed heavily. The bear's whimpering grew softer, but it was no less heart-wrenching. Jake's eyes scanned the animal's massive frame, and that's when he saw it, something that made his blood run cold. The grizzly's left paw was mangled, twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped through the thick fur, staining the pristine white snow beneath it. The sight made Jake's stomach churn. He had seen injuries like this before, and he knew immediately what had caused it: a poacher's snare. The scars around the wound, the way the paw was torn and raw, left no doubt in his mind. Jake felt a surge of anger rise within him, hot and unrelenting. The thought of someone using such a cruel, indiscriminate method to trap an animal filled him with disgust. The bear must have been trapped for hours, maybe even days, struggling to free itself. Jake could only imagine the pain it had endured, the desperation it must have felt as it fought against the unforgiving metal jaws of the snare. The very thought sent a chill through him. The wilderness was harsh, yes, but it was also fair. Animals lived and died by the rules of nature. But this was something entirely different. This was human cruelty, an unnatural intrusion into the balance of the wild. Jake's eyes returned to the bear's face, and his heart ached at what he saw there. The bear wasn't just in physical pain, it was emotionally broken. Its dark eyes, so full of sorrow, seemed to hold an unspoken question. Why? Why had this happened? Why had it been subjected to such suffering? Jake didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't turn his back on the bear and leave it to suffer alone. Slowly, Jake knelt down, his movements careful and deliberate. He was now at eye level with the bear, and the sheer size of it was overwhelming. Even injured, the grizzly was a powerful creature, its presence commanding and awe-inspiring. But in this moment, all Jake could see was its pain. The bear didn't move, didn't growl or lash out. It simply watched him, its eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's okay," Jake said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached into his pack, pulling out a small first aid kit he always carried with him. It wasn't much, just some bandages, antiseptic, and a few basic tools. But it was all he had. He wasn't sure how he was going to help the bear, but he knew he had to try. The bear let out a low rumbling sound, and for a moment, Jake froze. But the sound wasn't a growl. It was something else entirely, something almost like relief. The bear shifted slightly, its massive frame trembling with the effort, and extended its injured paw toward him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The gesture was so deliberate, so human, that it nearly brought tears to his eyes. The bear was trusting him, placing its fate in his hands. Jake reached out slowly, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the bear's fur. The heat of the injury was startling, a stark reminder of how severe the wound was. He worked carefully, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The bear remained still, its breathing heavy but even, as Jake began to examine the mangled paw. The trap had done more damage than he had hoped, cutting deep into the flesh and leaving behind jagged wounds. "I'm sorry," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know if the bear understood his words, but he spoke them anyway. He worked quickly, his focus unshakable as he cleaned the wound and wrapped it with the bandages from his kit. The bear let out a soft, almost contented sound as Jake finished, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in its eyes. Gratitude. As Jake sat back, his hands trembling from the effort, he looked at the bear and felt a profound sense of connection. This wasn't just a wild animal anymore. It was a living being, one that had suffered and fought to survive. And in that moment, Jake knew he would do whatever it took to help it. The wilderness, so often a place of division between man and beast, had become the stage for an unbreakable bond, a bond forged in compassion and trust. Jake's stomach turned, a sickening feeling spreading through his chest as he stared at the sight before him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The bear, a creature he had spent his life respecting and fearing in equal measure, was no longer the untouchable beast of the wild. It was a victim, a living being that had been suffering in silence, trapped in the harsh and unforgiving wilderness, unable to free itself. Jake's breath hitched as he took in the full weight of the situation. The bear wasn't a predator anymore, not in his eyes. It was something else entirely, a creature in pain, clinging to whatever sliver of hope it could find. The bear looked up at him, its massive body trembling from exhaustion and pain. Its dark, pleading eyes held his gaze, unblinking and filled with an emotion Jake had never expected to see: trust. Its breath was ragged and labored, each exhale visible in the icy air, like a fragile signal of its will to survive. Jake felt an ache deep in his chest, an overwhelming tide of compassion that swept away every instinct he had honed as a hunter. In that moment, everything changed. The hunter had become the hunted, not in a literal sense, but in a way that shook Jake to his core. The predator, who had spent years controlling and navigating the wilderness, was now faced with something far more powerful, a raw human emotion that rendered him powerless: compassion. Jake's hands shook as he slowly knelt down, the enormity of what he was about to do crashing down on him like an avalanche. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the otherwise quiet sounds of the wilderness. He wasn't sure what he could do, or if anything he tried would even make a difference. But one thing was certain: he couldn't stand by and do nothing. The bear needed him. Its silent plea was clear in its eyes, and Jake felt an unshakable resolve settle over him. He had to help. The grizzly, sensing Jake's intention, held perfectly still, its massive frame no longer threatening, but instead resigned. It made no move to flee, no attempt to lash out in fear or defense. Instead, it seemed to accept that this human was no longer a danger, but a lifeline, the only chance it had. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat as he cautiously reached out, his fingers trembling as they inched toward the bear's injured paw. When his hand finally made contact, Jake flinched at the searing heat radiating from the wound. The bear's paw was swollen and mangled, its flesh torn and raw from the cruel grip of the trap. Blood oozed slowly from the gashes, staining the snow beneath it in stark contrast to the pure white surrounding them. Jake's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay calm. The bear let out a low, quiet sound, one that Jake could only describe as a sigh of relief. It wasn't threatening or defensive. It was almost as if the bear was thanking him. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry as he whispered, "It's okay. I've got you." He didn't know if the bear could understand the words, but it didn't matter. He needed to say them, needed to believe them himself. He glanced at the trap, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. The snare was buried deep into the bear's paw, its jagged edges biting cruelly into the flesh. Jake had the basic knowledge of how to tend to injuries. He'd patched up cuts and bruises on himself and others during countless hunting trips. But this, a grizzly bear? It felt impossible. Still, he couldn't leave. Walking away and leaving the bear to suffer alone wasn't an option. He could see the trust in its eyes, fragile and tentative, but there nonetheless. The bear couldn't speak, couldn't communicate with words, but the pain etched into its gaze spoke louder than anything. It was asking for help, and Jake couldn't turn his back on that. With a deep, steadying breath, Jake shifted his attention to the trap. His hands moved with careful precision, his fingers working to release the tension in the cruel mechanism. The metal was cold and unyielding, its sharp edges biting into his gloves as he wrestled with it. His mind was consumed by the bear's pain, the urgent need to act quickly driving him forward. Every whimper the bear made sent a jolt through him, a visceral reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about removing the trap, it was about saving a life. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Jake worked, the seconds dragging on with agonizing slowness. The trap was rusted, its mechanisms stiff and uncooperative, but Jake didn't stop. He couldn't. His hands ached from the effort, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, but he pushed through the discomfort. The bear remained still, its eyes locked on him with an intensity that was both unnerving and grounding. Jake could feel the weight of the bear's trust, the unspoken understanding between them that bound them together in this moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trap gave way with a harsh metallic snap. Jake let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he pulled the mangled paw free. The bear let out a low, rumbling growl, not one of aggression, but of relief. The sound reverberated through the clearing, and Jake felt a surge of emotion rise within him. He had done it. He had freed the bear from its cruel prison, but the work wasn't done. Jake's eyes flicked to the wound, and his heart sank. The damage was severe, the flesh torn and swollen. The bear wouldn't survive long without proper care. Reaching into his pack, Jake pulled out the small first aid kit he always carried. It wasn't much, just a few basic supplies, but it was better than nothing. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best as he could before wrapping it tightly with bandages. His hands moved with a practiced steadiness, every motion deliberate and careful. The bear watched him the entire time, its massive body trembling slightly, but otherwise calm. Jake could feel its gaze on him, could sense the unspoken gratitude in its eyes. The bond between them had deepened, a fragile thread of trust that connected two very different beings in a way that defied explanation. When Jake finally sat back, his work complete, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His hands were covered in blood, his muscles aching from the effort. But he didn't care. He looked at the bear, at its bandaged paw and its weary eyes, and felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The bear let out another low, rumbling sound, its head dipping slightly as if in acknowledgement. "You're going to be okay," Jake said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. He didn't know if the words were true, but he needed to believe them, for both their sakes. The bear shifted slightly, its injured paw resting on the snow as it leaned its massive frame forward. For a moment, Jake thought it might collapse, but it held itself steady, its gaze never leaving his. The trust in its eyes was undeniable now, a silent agreement between man and beast that neither would forget. Jake stood slowly, his legs stiff from kneeling in the snow. The wilderness stretched out around them, vast and unyielding. But for the first time, Jake didn't feel alone. The bear, once a creature of fear and awe, had become something much more. A reminder of the fragility of life and the power of compassion. As Jake looked down at the grizzly, at the creature that had shown him its rawest vulnerability, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't leave the bear to face the wilderness alone. Not now, not ever. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the trap gave way with a sharp metallic snap, and Jake pulled the bear's paw free. He exhaled shakily, his hands trembling from the tension of the moment. The bear let out a low, rumbling growl, its tone far from threatening. To Jake, it sounded like relief, a kind of unspoken gratitude that sent a wave of emotion surging through him. He glanced down at the bear's mangled paw, the sight of the raw flesh and drying blood making his stomach churn. This wasn't over. The trap was gone, but the damage it had inflicted remained, and Jake knew the bear wouldn't survive long in the wild without help. But what could he do? He wasn't a vet or a wildlife specialist. He was just a hunter, A man who had come here with the intention of tracking and potentially killing the very creature now looking up at him with eyes that held an almost human vulnerability. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat as he realized the enormity of the moment. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't just leave the bear to fend for itself, not after what it had endured. Its survival depended on him now, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like the frigid Alaskan air. Jake reached into his pack and pulled out the small emergency first aid kit he always carried. It wasn't much, just a few bandages, antiseptic wipes, and some gauze. But it would have to do. He knelt down carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. The bear, to his surprise, remained still, its dark eyes watching him with a mixture of curiosity and trust. The tension in Jake's chest eased slightly. It seemed the bear understood that he wasn't a threat. Maybe it even recognized him as a lifeline, a slim chance in an otherwise unforgiving wilderness. With practiced precision, Jake cleaned the wound as best as he could. The antiseptic stung as it touched the bear's torn flesh, and the animal let out a soft, pained whimper. "I know," Jake murmured, his voice low and soothing. "I know it hurts, but it'll help. Just hang in there." He wasn't sure if the bear could comprehend his words, but speaking to it helped calm his own nerves. He worked quickly, wrapping the paw with gauze and securing it with the emergency bandages. The makeshift dressing wasn't perfect, but it was enough to stem the bleeding and protect the wound from further infection, at least for now. When he finished, Jake sat back on his heels and let out a long, shaky breath. His hands were still trembling, and his heart felt like it was racing a mile a minute. The bear let out another low growl, softer this time, and Jake couldn't help but interpret it as a sign of relief. He reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering for a moment before lightly brushing against the bear's fur. "You're going to be okay," he said quietly, though the words felt more like a promise to himself than to the bear. But even as he said it, Jake knew the truth. The bear wasn't safe, not here, not like this. The wilderness was harsh and unyielding, and an injured animal was an easy target for predators. The thought of the bear, vulnerable and alone, struggling to survive in its current state made Jake's chest ache. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. "Stay here," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. "I'll get you help. You're not alone." He didn't know if the bear understood, but the way it looked at him made him believe that maybe, just maybe, it did. Its eyes, still filled with pain, now held a flicker of trust, a fragile bond that Jake knew he couldn't break. As he stood, his mind raced with the enormity of what lay ahead. Getting the bear to safety wouldn't be easy. The nearest shelter was miles away, and the journey back would be long and treacherous. The Alaskan wilderness wasn't kind to the unprepared, and even Jake, with his years of experience, felt the weight of the challenge before him. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a hunter. He didn't feel like a predator. He felt like something entirely different, a protector of the wilderness, of the creatures that roamed it, and of the one living being that had shown him the rawest form of vulnerability. The bear shifted, its massive body trembling as it slowly rose to its feet. Jake held his breath, ready to move at the first sign of aggression, but none came. The bear limped forward, its injured paw held gingerly off the ground, and looked at him as if waiting for guidance. Jake's heart clenched. This wasn't just a wild animal anymore. This was a creature that trusted him, that relied on him, and he couldn't let it down. "Okay," Jake said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. "Let's get you out of here." He adjusted the strap of his pack and took a step forward, glancing back to see if the bear would follow. To his amazement, it did. The grizzly limped after him, its movements slow and labored, but determined. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for the animal's resilience. Despite everything it had been through, it was still fighting. The journey back was grueling. The snow was deep, the wind biting, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. Jake kept a careful pace, mindful of the bear's injury. He paused frequently, giving the animal time to rest, and each time, the bear would look at him with those same trusting eyes as if to say, "I'll keep going as long as you do." The bond between them grew with every step, an unspoken understanding forged in the stillness of the wilderness. As the hours stretched on, Jake's mind wandered. He thought about his life, about the choices that had led him here. He had always considered himself a man of the wild, someone who understood the delicate balance between predator and prey. But this experience had changed him. The wilderness wasn't just a place of survival. It was a place of connection, of unexpected moments that revealed the deepest parts of who you were. Jake realized he wasn't just helping the bear. The bear was helping him too, showing him a side of himself he hadn't known existed. By the time they reached the edge of the tree line, the sun was beginning to set, casting the snow-covered landscape in hues of gold and pink. Jake could see the faint outline of the shelter in the distance, a small cabin he had used on previous hunting trips. Relief washed over him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the journey wasn't over yet. There was still so much to do, so much uncertainty. But Jake pushed those thoughts aside. For now they had made it this far, and that was enough. He turned to the bear, its massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. It looked back at him, and in that moment Jake felt a profound sense of peace. They had faced the wilderness together, man and beast, and had emerged with a bond that would change them both forever. As they continued toward the cabin, Jake couldn't help but think that sometimes the wild has a way of showing you who you truly are, when you least expect it.